Howdy, folks. Mr. Reardon here. I'd like to walk you through the structure of a basic literary analysis essay. So, this is an essay that you might use in a ninth grade English class, and it does not have an introduction or conclusion. It's like just the bare bones thesis and three body paragraphs that you might use to put together um, a really specific kind of literary analysis essay. And this is exactly the kind I have my ninth grade students start with at the very beginning of the year in September, just so they can sort of get their feet wet with respect to how to think about and do literary analysis. So, before we jump into the structure, I want to just answer this question that I get from students very often. Why learn literary analysis? Why does it matter? Why do we spend so much time on literary analysis in English classes? So, number one, well, in many English classes and in high school, or in high school and in college, it's one of the two kinds of academic essays you're going to be asked to write. This is not true in just my class. It's not true at just Palo Alto High School where I work. It's true all over the United States. It's true in many other countries, even non-English speaking countries. It is literary analysis is just it's one of the kinds of writing that the academic world see as particularly valuable. And so, if you want to be successful in the academic world, you need to know how to do analysis. The other kind of essay, of course, is argumentative writing. And at some point in your education, the two will sort of converge into literary criticism. But for now, we think of them as sort of separate things. Analyzing an author's techniques, making your own arguments about different topics, two sort of different buckets. So you need to know how to do this because you have to know how to do it in school. It's sort of I know a little bit circular there, but you may as well learn it now because you're going to be asked to do it maybe with a little bit less actual instruction and support in other contexts. Number two, if you take AP English Literature as a senior, assuming that you watching this, you're a high school student, probably a freshman, maybe one of my freshmen, you're going to take AP Lit as a senior. And so AP Lit takes everything that you learn in English 9A and like amplifies it in terms of volume and difficulty. The skills you learn here, though, will set you up for learning the skills that you need to be successful in AP English Literature. Also, the writing portion of the SAT, as I wrote this presentation and as I'm giving it right now in October 2020, the SAT writing question is an analysis question. It's actually a rhetorical analysis question, not literary analysis. The piece you'll run into is going to be nonfiction. I think all the pieces that I've seen on the SAT recently have been nonfiction. I think theoretically they could put some fiction on there, but it's probably going to be nonfiction. If you use the basic strategies that you learn for literary analysis on the SAT essay, you will do just fine. And of course, there's this bigger question, like why does literature matter, right? Like why do we need to know? Why do we read literature? Why do we need to know about literature? So as you go through your life, you're constantly going to be exposed to stories. It could be through books, like actually novels. It could be through media. It could just be through other people telling you stories. So the literary analysis essay is a genre that helps you to practice the kind of deep thinking that later in your life can be automatic. That's like this thinking is about what a story might mean for individuals, for humanity, for society. Like what is the message that we should take with us about how to live our lives and how to live as better people. It can help you thinking deeply about the experiences of others and their stories can help you to empathize with them and to just and become a more I guess a nicer, more well-rounded, more caring and empathetic human being. Um, if you are like someone who really likes watching movies or TV shows, knowing the strategies that the writers use to make those TV shows compelling and entertaining and yet still convey some kind of important message about society, that's a really, really important skill for you to have. So if you're practicing it in school with maybe some stories that you're not always that excited about, but if you once you or if you apply these same concepts and these same ideas to the media you enjoy and consume all the time, you're going to get way more out of those TV shows and movies than you do without knowing about these literary strategies. Okay, so back to writing a literary analysis essay. So this is the most basic structure of a literary analysis essay. Like, you can't get any more basic than this. If you do, it's not really an essay anymore. You have a thesis statement and a certain number of paragraphs. You could write one with two, but in this model, I would say that three is the ideal number of body paragraphs. So a thesis statement will contain two things. It contains a character arc or a reference to a character's development over the course of a story, and it contains a thematic message. So the simplest way to express a character's arc is by using adjectives. You choose one adjective to describe the character, like their personality, their attitude, their actions, some aspect of them. One adjective to describe them from the beginning of the story. Um, one describing them in the middle of the story, and one describing them at the end of the story. And then when you put those together, that's a character arc, and that experience of the character changing from the beginning to the middle to the end conveys a thematic message about about something, about how people do or should live, or the how people who behave a certain way often have some kind of result. Um, as you'll see on a future slide, I always like to say, right, thematic messages should have the structure: people who something often have some result. People who do this thing often have that result. And you can put in different words in those little blanks there in order to make infinite thematic messages. So then, once you have that thesis statement, you have a roadmap for writing the rest of your essay. The first body paragraph is trying to prove that the first adjective is true, right? So if you say that the character is proud in the first paragraph, or in your first body paragraph in your thesis statement, then you need to prove that that your character is in fact proud at the beginning of the story. Same thing for the second body paragraph. If you say that in the middle of the story the character is humiliated, well, then you need to prove that the character was humiliated. And paragraph 3, the same. Prove your adjective. Now, there's also a thematic piece, a thematic goal in each body paragraph. So in addition to proving your adjective is true, you need to explain logically, right? How does this piece of the character arc set up a situation for the message to be conveyed? And that's what you do in body paragraph 1 and also in body paragraph 2. Like, you can refer to plot here, right? Just you have to convincingly tie what's going on with the character at that point in the story to the overall intention of the author in conveying that thematic message. So for the third body paragraph, though, that thematic piece is a little bit different. Instead of just talking about how whatever's happening in that part of the story and that character behavior helps to convey or helps to push the story toward conveying the message, you actually explain how the whole character arc conveys the message in that third paragraph. So in my class, students are graded essentially only by whether or not they have all the pieces of each body paragraph. Each body paragraph has really specific pieces. Here I'm giving you the general overview of what the goal of each paragraph is. But on the next slide, we're going to start talking about the pieces of the body paragraph, like exactly how to accomplish these goals. Again, this essay doesn't have an introduction or conclusion. Those are some things I might talk about in a different context. But for now, this is just the basic structure. If you want to add an introduction or conclusion to your essay using some other model, of course, you're free to do that. It's your essay. Unless you're in my class, your first essay definitely should not have either. Please don't try to include them. So this is the thesis statement. The This here is a thesis statement that follows the same structure we saw on the last slide. It is about a short story called Birthday Party. This appeared on the AP English Literature exam a few years ago. There's actually a link to the story in the description of this video. So you can click on the story. The story is literally 3 paragraphs long. The essays about this story are longer than the story itself. You could pause the video right now, pull up the story, read it in literally 2 minutes, and then come back here and you would understand all of these examples about the story. I actually recommend you do that. And so this thesis statement is about Birthday Party. It is analyzing the husband. The husband is one of the 2 important characters in this story, and it is tying the husband's character arc to a message about pride and relationships. Well, actually, those pieces aren't there, of course. You don't see them because they're empty. But this is the basic structure. In her 1946 short story Birthday Party, Catherine Brush portrays the husband as your beginning adjective, the adjective describing the husband, the character that's being analyzed at the beginning of the story. Middle adjective in the middle. That's, again, the adjective that describes the character in the middle of the story, in this case in paragraph 2. And then end adjective at the end. That is the adjective that describes the husband at the end. Through the husband's character arc, Brush conveys the thematic message that people who something about pride, often something about relationships. Okay. So, structure of the literary analysis body paragraph. So, each of those body paragraphs that you saw in that overall essay structure is going to have all of these pieces. So, those paragraphs should start with a topic sentence. Those topic sentences will have a really specific structure that we'll go over. Then context for a quote. So context and quote sort of go together. Then word analysis or language analysis. Some people might call it language analysis. That's fine. Then character analysis. Then thematic analysis. So a paragraph that has all 6 of these pieces is likely to be a very solid literary analysis paragraph, even if it's not very long. Okay, so topic sentences. How are these put together? Well, topic sentences should have 4 pieces in this essay model. They should have a reference to the part of the character arc, that is the word beginning, the word middle, or the word end. They should have the name of the character or the label of the character if the character is not given a name, like the husband and wife in Birthday Party don't have names. The adjective describing the character in that part of the story. So that might be, for a Birthday Party, it might be proud at the beginning for the first body paragraph. And then a reference to part of the thematic message. So the thematic piece of the topic sentence. Bringing in a thematic topic word. So pride, relationships, consequences, etc. Would be a good way to acknowledge the theme in this part of the paragraph. So here are some examples of how these topic sentences might read. At the beginning of the story, the character is portrayed as the beginning adjective, which suggests to readers that thematic piece. Same deal here. In the middle of the story, the character is presented as middle adjective, which prepares readers for the thematic piece. And at the end of the story, character is portrayed as third adjective, which ultimately conveys the message that, and then you copy the entire thematic message, the same one that's in the thesis. Or you can reword it if you want to. But keeping it the same is a good idea for the most basic essay here. And my students should actually use the exact same one for their first paper. Okay. So some examples of those topic sentences. So again, my examples are about the wife. If you're in my class and you're writing an essay about the husband, you should be writing about the husband, not using my examples from the wife. You can borrow some of the language, though, like some of the language that doesn't refer to the wife. So again, we have a sample thesis statement here, a completed thesis with all those little square bracket spots filled in. In her 1946 short story Birthday Party, Catherine Brush portrays the wife as selfless at the beginning, gleeful in the middle, and heartbroken in the end. Brush uses the wife's character arc to convey the thematic message that people who show kindness for others often fail to receive the gratitude they were expecting. So I also want to point out here before we look at the topic sentences, in the thesis statement here, you have something I like to call Y tag. That's year, title, author, and genre. So year, 1946, title, birthday party, author, Catherine Brush, and genre, short story. What kind of text is it? I recommend that anytime you refer to a text for the first time in an academic essay, you include Y tag. It's just a good strategy. Here we have the first paragraph's topic sentence, and you can directly see the connection between the thesis statement and this topic sentence here. At the beginning of the story, part one, the wife character is portrayed as selfless, adjective, which suggests to readers that kindness will play a role later in the story, kindness will play a role in the story as it progresses. Second topic sentence, in the middle of the story, the wife is presented as gleeful, which prepares readers for the husband's lack of gratitude for the wife's kindness and for the wife's subsequent heartbreak. You can see again here, word middle, character's name, gleeful adjective, and then the thematic piece. And then paragraph 3, same deal. At the end of the story, the wife character is heartbroken, adjective, which ultimately conveys the message that, and then you have the identical message as the one that you see here up in that thesis statement. Okay, so you have your topic sentences. Now you need context. So context is a piece of a sentence that comes just before a quote in your paragraph. You will be using quotes from the short story you're reading to support the adjectives you chose describing the character at the beginning, middle, and end. But you can't just plop those quotes in there. You have to introduce them. You have to integrate them neatly into your essay. So context does two important things for your reader. It introduces the quote, like it actually helps the quote to fit nicely, smoothly into the paragraph. And it gives the reader some background information to help understand your quote, like where it's coming from. It's pretty easy to know where a quote's coming from in a 3-paragraph story that everyone's reading. But if it's, a 300-page novel that's being analyzed, you need more specific context so your reader knows exactly what spot in the novel the quote is coming from and what was going on around that time. You can use context in this structure, by the way, to introduce pretty much anything from a work of fiction. Any kind of moment you want to talk about, you can use the structure you're about to learn. In my class, right, I require a very specific structure for context. A reminder for my students, you're graded for your first essay entirely based on how well you follow the structure, even if all the pieces don't quite come together into a really great, objectively great paper. If you have all the pieces, you're going to earn an A on your first essay. Specific context structure. Well, the context has 3 pieces. A time word. Time words include all words that refer to time relationships between ideas. So after, during, while, before, as, just after, since, at, until, when, just before, all great examples. Then the second piece of context is characters' actions just before the quote. You could supplement characters' actions, as in what the character's doing right before the quote happens, with where the characters are, the location in which the action is happening. That's really helpful in like plays, for example, with Romeo and Juliet, where things happen in so many different locales that giving someone a reminder of exactly where everybody was, where everyone involved in the quote was, or in that particular moment in the story, like where the action is happening, that can be really helpful. And then the third piece of context is he, she says, or a synonym of says. So it could be yells, he yells, screams, cries, whispers, calls out, threatens, growls, or responds. Be sure to keep these in present tense. You always want to be writing in the present tense and never in the past. You always say says, not said, when you're writing about literature. So present tense, you need to write about the story as if it's happening right now in front of you. And there are way more options for synonyms for says than just than just the ones I've listed here. If you Google synonyms for says, you're going to get humongous lists. There's lists of like 500 of them on the internet. So after context, your quote would be placed, right? So this could all be part of one big sentence, or it could be two sentences. Sometimes the time word um, and the character's actions and location end up being a complete sentence, and then there's a period, and then there's a new sentence that says he says, comma, and then the entire quote. Or sometimes they all fit together in one complete sentence, all three pieces of context and the quote together. So either approach is totally fine. So example of context. Here's how it looks. This example is actually about a different story. Thank You, Ma'am by Langston Hughes. Easy to find if you haven't read it on the internet, but you don't really need to read it to understand how this example works. So we have our topic sentence following the structure. At the beginning of the story, Roger is portrayed as dishonest. We have beginning, character name, adjective, which suggests to readers that thematic piece, dishonest behavior will be important to the story's progression. Then we have our context. When, time word, Mrs. Jones asks Roger why he tried to steal her purse, character actions. He replies, that's a synonym for says, and then you have your quote. We're going to skip over this here. Second context example. At the beginning of the story, the wife is portrayed as kind, which suggests to readers that kindness will play a role later in the story. Just before time word, the head waiter brought in the birthday cake, character actions. The narrator tells readers, quote. Again, we'll skip over these questions. We don't need to look at those. We're going to look at quote next. So, what's a quote? Well, a quote is the word, phrase, or sentence you take away from the story. You take from the story to prove that the adjective that you chose is correct. It's the evidence that grounds your paragraph. If you say the husband in birthday party is proud, you need to find a word or phrase or a quote from the first paragraph that proves the husband is proud. So, I said that. I'm going to use some extra language here, though. The quote serves as evidence of the claim you're making about the character. So you're claiming that the husband is proud. You now need to find evidence or a quote to prove that, or to support that claim, to prove that. Be sure you always cite your evidence correctly. If you're following MLA, which is required in my classes, you have your quote, and then you open parentheses. There's one space here too. Don't forget that space. Be sure you hit the space bar. And then last name is Brush in this case. So author's last name, and then one space, and then the paragraph number or page number if you're looking at a novel, or line number if you're taking an AP test. Typically, you should use the smallest number that is provided to you. So like on the AP tests, they give you the line number, so use them. For paragraphs, if you number the paragraphs, use that. Novels, they give you the page numbers. Close parentheses, and then a period. If there's normally a period in the quote, like the quote ends in a period, take it out. Delete that period. Move it to the end. If there's a question mark or an exclamation point in the quote, that's actually semantically meaningful. That means something to the quote, so you can't take it out. Instead, you leave the exclamation point or question mark there, and then you add an extra period after the citation that wasn't there before. Okay. So the quote examples are exactly the same context examples, except I added the quotes. So when Mrs. Jones asks Roger why he tried to steal her purse, he replies, I didn't aim to, and then the correct citation with the period at the end. Same thing here. Just before the head waiter brought in the birthday cake, the narrator tells readers that this was an occasion, in fact, the husband's birthday, and the wife had planned a little surprise for him. Citation, period. Okay, so you have a quote. Cool. It's now time to do some word analysis. At this point, we're moving away from claim and evidence, and we're getting into the world of reasoning. right? Like, okay, you need to explain how that evidence does in fact prove the claim you made about the husband or about whatever character you're analyzing. So word analysis involves unpacking the language. So from the quote in your paragraph, you should choose the most meaningful one word or short phrase. Pull a quote or short phrase, pull a word or a short phrase out of the longer quote that you just placed into your paragraph. Then for that word, for the word you chose, you should choose the juiciest, most meaningful word you can think of, you can find in that quote. All right, I want you can provide either the definition of the word as it's used in the story, so just state a definition, or you could talk about associations as well, or connotations of a word. So, for example, if a story were to use the words march and salute and taps and veteran all within a single paragraph or something, there would be all this language that's associated with the military, and so or the armed forces, and so you could then like talk about how all these words have this shared association. That would be talking about association. But I mentioned that first because definition is actually a much better way, at least for these simpler essays, to go about word analysis. So just state a definition. Self-satisfied in this context means that blank. Crying is something that people typically do when they are extremely upset, right? State a definition like it would appear in a dictionary. You could even use an actual dictionary definition as long as it's clear and consistent with the way the word was actually used in the story. Don't cite the dictionary, by the way. Now, very important rule for word analysis. You have to make sure that you follow this rule or your word analysis will not come together. It's like, not letting your yeast rise when you're making bread, right? You have to do this step. If you make this mistake, you're going to end up with really terrible analysis. You are not allowed to say the name of the character you're analyzing in word analysis. You can mention other characters' names, but you can't mention the name of the character you're analyzing. So if you're analyzing the husband in Birthday Party, you cannot say the husband in your word analysis. State the definition first. The next piece of the paragraph will let you talk about the husband. Don't talk about the character yet. So there's an example here. I would tell my students, don't copy this, just understand. So you can see how the word analysis works in this sample. I'll read from the context through to the end of the word analysis. Just before the head waiter brought in the birthday cake, the narrator tells readers that this was an occasion, in fact, the husband's birthday, and the wife had planned a little surprise for him. To plan a little surprise for someone means to make arrangements for him or her without their knowledge, which is not always an easy thing to do. So we have our word analysis there. You can see, right, to plan a little surprise, this is a phrase that was pulled out of the quote and the definition was provided. Like, what does that mean in the context? So that was word analysis. Now let's do some character analysis. For character analysis, once you've unpacked the language, you then need to tie that language to character. Right? You need to use some of the language in your word analysis to prove that your adjective in the topic sentence describing the character does in fact apply to that character. Again, you're doing reasoning here. So the best way to understand this is to look at an example. So to plan a little surprise for someone means to make arrangements for him or her without their knowledge, which is not always an easy thing to do. That the wife made these arrangements for her husband at the restaurant indicates that she's a kind person. Right. So I know the adjective switched from selfless to kind. I realized that I forgot to change that in this presentation. Oops. Oh well, I think they both work. So you can use kind, you can use selfless, but it should be kept consistent. So again, though, I'm tying kind is my adjective, and I'm trying to prove that at the beginning of the story, the wife was in fact portrayed as kind. I have context for the quote. The quote helps to support the claim that she was kind. I pull out some language, plan a little surprise, give a definition, and then I tie that language back to the argument that she's a kind person. So once you've done that character analysis, then you can do thematic analysis. You're tying to theme. So you unpack the language, you tied it back to character, and now you're tying this point in the character arc to theme. So you're writing a sentence or two that connects what you said in the character analysis back to the thematic piece of your topic sentence. Two things you shouldn't do. You shouldn't mention the adjective for your next paragraph in thematic analysis. And the other thing you shouldn't do is write an extra concluding sentence after thematic analysis. If you do thematic analysis correctly in each paragraph, it ends your paragraph. You don't actually need to add anything else. So again, I can give you the definition of thematic analysis, but the best way to understand how it works is to look at this example. I'll start with the word analysis here. To plan a little surprise for someone means to make arrangements for him or her without their knowledge, which is not always an easy thing to do. That the wife made these arrangements for her husband at the restaurant indicates that she's a kind person. She intends for her kindness to bring both her and her husband a lot of joy, but the opposite soon happens. So here, it's just like acknowledging the role of this particular moment, right? The role of her kindness at the beginning of the story in the overall progression of events, the overall progression of the conveying of the thematic message, or the story that will convey the thematic message. So, a little more to say about thematic analysis. As I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, the third paragraph does a slightly different thing than the other paragraphs. You have to explain how the whole character arc, so beginning, middle, and end together, conveys the thematic message. And so you need to be sure you're actually doing that explanation. You need to be convincing in your pursuit of that goal. So bringing in plot is a good way to do this, right? Bring in some things that happen in the story, and those events, the explaining those events, tying those events to the character arc, can help you to engage in strong thematic analysis. So here's an example of the third body paragraph in that or for the wife. It's the, again, same, it would be in the same essay as the other examples, but it's the third paragraph instead of the first one that like we were looking at earlier. I'll read the whole thing actually. At the end of the story, the wife is heartbroken, which ultimately conveys the message that people who show kindness for others often fail to receive the gratitude they were expecting. Just after the husband says something quick and curt and unkind to his wife, the narrator reports that she was crying hopelessly all to herself under the gay big brim of her best hat. Crying is an action people typically take when they're extremely upset, and to be crying hopelessly in public suggests a truly extreme degree of sadness. The wife's intense crying and evident sadness in this moment indicates that she's totally heartbroken by her husband's reaction. Despite her kind act at the beginning of the story and the rising glee she experienced when the headwaiter brought out her surprise cake, her husband did not experience joy and instead became furious, attacking her for embarrassing him and causing her total heartbreak. The wife's experience in this story suggests that people who show kindness for others often fail to receive the gratitude they were expecting. Okay, so thematic analysis done. If you'd like to see the complete sample essay about the wife that incorporates all the examples from this presentation, as well as the second body paragraph and the thesis statement and correct MLA format, you can go to this link right here. I'll also put this in the description with the story itself. So you could click on this and get a sense of how this essay looks. And I want to mention 4 of many possible ways to build on this very basic structure. All right, this is like a first thing you do in 9th grade English body paragraph structure, and so those essays wouldn't really be seen as good literary analysis essays by anyone outside of the class where they're being done typically, because they're so bare bones and so simplistic. But once you know that structure and you have the structure down as a student, you can then start adding things to it, start changing it, start making it into something that's really powerful, helpful, and interesting, and leads you to doing really strong literary analysis. So one thing you can do to develop the literary analysis is to add multiple quote units to the paragraphs. This is recommended when you want to provide multiple quotes for each part of a character's arc. So let's say we had a story where we wanted 2 quotes to prove that the character is, I don't know, guilty or is feeling guilty at the beginning of the story, right? There might be the writer of the essay might want to put, one quote from the first chapter and one quote from the third chapter, and together those 2 quotes would help to make the argument that the character is guilty. Maybe one quote is a sort of a good example, and then the second quote is an even better example, and so the whole paragraph becomes that much more convincing. So when you do that, it ends up looking like this image that appeared on the side of the screen, where you have your topic sentence and the rest of the structure: context, quote, word, character, thematic analysis. But this here is just one quote unit. We use this term quote unit to refer to context through thematic analysis. And then you can continue the paragraph by transitioning, by saying something like, in addition, a little bit later in the story, just after the character does this and this, he says this thing, right? You can transition from one character's thematic analysis, one bit of thematic analysis to the context of the second quote unit, provide your second quote, do more analysis. And in this case, you do need a concluding sentence that sort of ties together everything that's going on in the paragraph. Okay. Second thing you might do would be to add more adjectives, add more paragraphs and more adjectives to capture more parts of a character's arc. So the 3 adjectives, beginning, middle, end, is kind of artificial. Works well for really short stories, but in a longer novel, you might talk about how the character changes from in 5 different ways over the course of the story, in which case you'd have 5 body paragraphs, each with 1 or 2 quote units, your choice. And those would make an even more complex character arc. A third thing you can do, this is definitely something I would have juniors do when I teach them in honors American literature. And so instead of focusing on single adjectives to trace the character arc, a character's development is traced through one VLACMIF. VLACMIF is an acronym standing for values, longings, attitudes, conflicts, motives, intentions, flaws, and fears. And so you can analyze how a character's longing for something, or attitude towards something, or conflict with something changes from the beginning to the middle to the end of the story, or from the beginning to the early middle to the late middle to the end of the story. Again, having 3 points is artificial. There could be multiple. But instead of just using an adjective to describe the character, which is kind of simplistic and feels funny even to stronger writers, you can follow it. You can follow a VLACMIF through the story, and that's a much stronger way to do the literary analysis. So that arc, of course, would still tie to a thematic message, would still convey a thematic message. My students can see an example of this. I provided an example with a short story by Jhumpa Lahiri called Mrs. Sens. It's in the week 10 folder in Schoology in fall. This is fall 2020, of course. So a fourth thing you could do to develop this model even more, would be to not only do step 3, that is develop a character arc based on a VLACMIF, but also identify a recurring symbolic motif. That's a thing that shows up over and over in the story and also has an additional meaning. Common motifs that one might see, common symbolic motifs in different novels, might be flowers, colors, so all kinds of colors, red, blue, yellow, green, any color, types of clothing or accessories. If top hats keep appearing in a story over and over again in different situations, if a particularly interesting kind of dress keeps appearing on female characters in a story, that might be interesting. Maybe parts of buildings. There are weird archways all over the place. Animals. If there's like a cat showing up in every other chapter, probably something to think about. Right? Weather phenomena. Rain and clouds and sunlight are almost always symbolic, so look for them. Right? And water. of course. Look for water in The Great Gatsby. If you have to read that, people, it's there and it's super heckin' symbolic. The Great Gatsby is actually a great example of this. You can trace how the symbol of water, the motif of water, at the beginning, middle, and end of the story help to trace Gatsby's experience, Gatsby's longing for a life that he is totally incapable of actually having, because that's not how the world works. So it goes from water motif to longing to thematic message. That's almost like a college level literary analysis essay at that point. Or like an AP Lit final or something. So really difficult, really challenging, big paper. We're talking 5 to 10 pages, but very, very satisfying to write. Okay, that is all I have for you. So thank you and happy writing.